Here is the first of many what we will call lemon drops, where I just kind of throw at you something to think about and something to practice as you're learning how to develop your skills as an artist. In this first drop, I want to point out 3 typical ways of shading a form or creating tone. And this would be using a line tool, since that is really, unless you work digitally and use the marquee tool or some kind of lasso type tool or trapping tool to fill everything all at once, you're building things up linearly, one line at a time. These are the 3 most used methods. There are other methods as well, like pointillism, and then using other types of tools to shade with, like using letter forms, using number forms, using shapes like stars or squares, etc. This is more of a stylization, where these 3 are a more practical use and a more traditional direction in turning form. So hatching is the act of creating parallel lines to each other and making tone and gradation through the line signature. Now, the thing that you want to keep in mind is that each line that you use should overlap the previous line if you want to create a continuous tone. And the other thing to keep in mind is that you want a consistent pressure that is being applied to each line as you lay them down. And that pressure can vary. We can lighten the pressure, and this is going to give us a gradation of sorts, but we still want each line to overlap the previous so that there isn't this sort of inconsistency that sits between each of the lines. Cross-hatching is the act of going both across the short of the form and down the length of the form. And by putting both of those different line types together, the eye begins to see the dimensional form immediately. Now, you can hatch or cross-hatch with line gaps in between, but you want those lines to have a spacing to them. And what you're really looking for if you're trying to build a realism is something that is more continuous. So that again means making sure that each line that you're working with overlaps the previous. Now, something that I'm doing wrong here, these little bumps or dots over off to the side are causing a little disturbance in the form. You can see a lack of flow. And the way that you want your lines to be drawn is something like this, where you start light, work heavy, and then end light. So, and by doing this, you can continue the lines through without any distress or distraction. The problem with that little dot is that you have these little interruptions in the length of your line. I'm going to do this again, and I'm going to be a little more mindful of not trying to make that little blip at the end of the line, which a few of them do have. To get rid of that in a digital way, we would turn our pen into the clear pen. This is in Photoshop. I'm not sure if the other programs actually have a clear pen or not. And then I'm lightly hatching back over those ends to unify them with the rest of the line. But now going back to the cross hatching, I want the lines this way to all connect together. And if there's a little gap, to go through the gap and fill it in. Then going in this direction, I want to do the same thing, but now going in this direction helps me turn the form because I'm going to vary the values along the length line as opposed to the cross contour, which is what this line is, arcing up and over the pipe form that I'm generating through the illusion. The hatch lines go in one direction, and we would call this the short line. Within a plane, it's sort of the same thing. I mean, a square is a square, so you're going to have the same distance in both directions. Now, if I go this way, it builds out a flatness in the surface. Then if I go this way, I'm going to create a gradation across the surface, and we'll be able to see where our light source is coming from, knowing that the corner that's the lightest is where the light source is starting. And then as it gets darker, the light source is spreading across the form and reaching out to the farthest sides. Veiling is the act of shading with a swirl. So the tighter I make that swirl, the more ambiguous the hatching is, right? Because I'm not actually creating a line form. I'm filling everything in with this kind of tornado-like effect. And it gives a slightly different end result than this does. In either case, though, they can both appear very smooth. This adds structure where this just creates a flatness of tone. There's nothing wrong with either one either. This, though, has a different energy to it. And you can produce a gradation with it. You just have to remember that pressure to the implement that you're working with is the way that you create that gradient, as well as going back over the tones, a second pass, and then a third pass. You can do it all at once. You just have more at play in remembering that you're trying to change the pressure as you go. And in this way, it is sometimes harder to recognize that boundary where we want the darker tones to terminate. And that edge line within the contour of the shadow form can vary all over the place, where you can control it a little easier with both of these methodologies. Not to say that this one cannot be controlled, because it can. It just takes more work to control it. You can leave gaps, but it will appear a little more turbulent to the eyes, which there's nothing wrong with that either. If there is some kind of message you're trying to convey through the application of how you're shading, then go crazy with it, because the end result is really what counts the most. If you're training, however, to learn control of your tools so that you have the flexibility and freedom to do any kind of tonality that you need, and I'll kind of, as I'm saying all of this, I'll use letters to describe what I mean by that. To block in tone, you can use anything at your disposal as long as you feel comfortable with it. Now, this is not necessarily the most practical way to do things, but imagine you're doing a portrait of a writer or a poet. Might be a cool idea to do all of your shading with the tool that they use to express their feelings on paper for us to read. There's something symbolic in the usage of that. If I'm trying to turn the form, though, I need to remember that I am in control of the implement fully and completely. And it's my understanding of the amount of pressure that I'm applying and when that pressure should change and where that pressure should change, so that I can continue turning the form appropriately without it getting too messy. I'm going to use some traditional tools to show the same thing here with what I'm doing, to show that it's not just a digital thing. However, the digital tool that I'm working with is something that I find is close to a traditional tool as far as its appearance goes, as well as its application. When I'm using this particular brush digitally, I get the same feeling and the same sensation as if I'm working with a pencil or charcoal stick or pastel, for that matter. The key here is just remembering to compress the lines. Open spacing between the lines means that you should stay more consistent with the distance between each of those lines, which does require more dexterity than overlapping the lines, which just requires a little bit more control. Control over dexterity. But both count. If you're doing comics, this might be the ultimate way to go here, giving you more variability in transition using the gaps, right? The larger the gap, the lighter the value. The closer the lines are to each other, the darker the value, and so forth. And one last time, when you're putting those lines down, there is the ability to start punctual. So each line I'm going to do, I'm going to start sharp and end sharp. But it is the ending point of the line that's going to suffer the most, while the starting point, I can control the amount of pressure. This is what you're really trying to learn how to do. And that does take more practice and a little bit more finesse with the way we handle our implement. But in the long run, what it gives you is this space to continue the line. And by the time you're done with that line, the line should feel continuous and as if you had done the whole thing in one pull, as opposed to a bunch of short, choppy lines, which is kind of referred to as scratching the lines in. And really messy lines is what you would call chicken scratching. Not that there's anything wrong with that either, but it does show or feel a little bit more amateurish than having finesse and control with the lines and the ability to control the gradients through a more carefully applied line signature. The same process applies to when we're using a traditional implement as well. This pencil has a short tip to it, so it doesn't really reveal what I'm saying necessarily in the best example of a tool. Ultimately, if you're working academically, you want this pencil tip to be even longer so that you have more of a side to work with. But the side of the pencil is where you're going to produce the cleanest gradations. And again, you want this sort of light to dark to light thing to happen. Notice how the lines have changed all of a sudden, and both ends of these strokes have a lighter appearance to them, as opposed to stop, start, stop, stop, start, stop. These abrupt endings make it a little bit more difficult to see the continuation of a form. It creates an absolute boundary, or it creates an obstruction that needs to be removed so that we can continue the line straight through, if need be. Cross-hatching is the same thing. I'll put the line down in one particular direction. And the more you practice this, the quicker you can go through the space and fill it in. And then to get to the ends, we come up on the pencil tip just a little bit more and crosshatch the endings back into the overall tonality. Over here, I'm just going to use a full crosshatch line. And you can see from my application that it's beginning to turn it a little bit more like a cylinder as opposed to a plane. The plane is where we want to start those, especially if we're building local values. A highlight can be built in later, and in fact, the highlight would resemble the lighter area of the tone as opposed to the white of the paper, which is a false value to your forms because no highlight is actually white. It's a photograph that causes the highlight to look white, but the highlight is usually resembling the light source and the color of the light source. And if there's a color in the highlight, that means there's a value to it. It isn't just zero, meaning pure white. Veiling is the same thing. You're basically spinning the tool and you're creating a continuous veil of value, sort of a gauzy overlay of your space. And the more I back up on the amount of pressure that I apply to the implement, the lighter I can make the value. And if I go back over the values I've already created one more time and do the exact same thing with it, I can darken the value where I need to, or I can darken all the value where I need to, creating an even stronger gradient from a much darker value to a much lighter value. The key here is holding the pencil on its side and not using the pencil tip exclusively. which is going to take a lot longer to do. And as you can see, it shortens the space, or it applies far less tone, which means that we have a much smaller signature or footprint that we're building from. And this could result in causing the shading to take you exponentially longer to build as opposed to using the side of the pencil. Art or artists use the implements this way, where if we're writing, we hold it this way. If we're detailing a picture, definitely hold it this way, because then you have more fine-tuned control over the tip of the pencil. But for your overall coverage, you definitely want to learn how to use the pencil holding it like a baton, right? Holding it on its side and pulling your tones using the broadest part of the pencil, or whatever tool you're working with, charcoal, pastel, pencil, whatever it is that you're working with. You have this range, or this possibility of range, utilizing it. And the larger this length is here, the more of the broad side you have to work with, which means you can fill bigger spaces quicker using that, as opposed to looking at your small implement and going, oh my God, this huge space is going to take me all day to fill in. It can actually be quite quick as long as you practice this sideways holding, using the broad side of the tool and not just the tip alone. Writing leads to bad habits drawing. We do the same thing when we draw. And typically we hold the pencil really tight in here, and that causes all sorts of problems in the wrist, along in the carpal area. This is where carpal tunnel happens. It can also lead to clicking in the wrist and all sorts of other ailments that you'll feel much quicker. Whereas holding the pencil on the side, you're practically holding with no grip at all. You don't need the grip at all. You can use the weight of the pencil for the most part to do all of your shading with. Now, one last thing to keep in mind. You don't want to shade back and forth like this, because as you change direction, it leaves that dark signature at both ends. You want to pull all of your strokes going in the same direction. Pull the stroke, reset, pull the stroke, reset, pull the stroke. So your hand is going back and forth, but the strokes are being built in one uniform direction. Or when you shade back and forth, especially on a soft surface, you're actually building up more nap on the paper. Remember, the paper is a bunch of little fibers that are all woven together. And the more we pull back and forth, the more those fibers start to lift and fray. When you go to erase, those areas become more damaged. If I'm only shading in one particular direction, I'm not doing any damage to the surface. I'm just leaving a tone on the surface. And it's also going to lift much easier because the surface is still intact and is smooth. And I don't have any disruptions due to building into the paper and causing the paper to feel harsh in those particular areas. All right, good luck with your practice. If you have any questions, leave them in the link below, and I'll answer those as soon as I see them. Thank you again, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.